So this afternoon, we're going to move into a different session. In the morning, we looked at different models of consumer representation. And now this afternoon, we're going to consider different methodologies for considering what consumers in our sectors think about essential services and how they think about how they're regulated. And we're going to be looking at four areas. We're going to be looking at using behavioural insights, involvement in policy making, factoring in the public interest, and finally, research techniques with particular reference to willingness to pay and randomised control trials. So keep tweeting and keep your questions coming. We start with two contributions on behavioural insights. You've had a speaker with a Canadian accent. I'm now going to present you with a speaker with an Australian accent. Perth, I think, if I'm absolutely correct. So Elisabeth Costa, who is Head of Consumers, Energy and Sustainability at the Behavioural Insights team, is going to kick off with the discussion. So a big welcome for Elisabeth, please.
Great. Thanks so much, Roger, and thanks everyone for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be speaking. So as Roger said, I head up the Consumer and Energy team at the Behavioural Insights team. We in our team cover all of the regulated markets and consumer markets, and so we do quite a broad piece of work but have historically focused mainly on energy. Today I'd like to present the key findings from a report that we published back in March, which was commissioned by Citizens Advice and by Matthew and Anne, who are here today. And I just firstly want to take a step back and talk about why ourselves and Citizens Advice wanted to do this piece of work. So I think the Behavioural Insights team had always been interested in how behavioural science could be harnessed to give consumers more power and to help them make better choices for themselves within markets, not just regulated markets, but across the board. And so when Citizens Advice approached us and asked us to consider a new framework and a new vision for regulating with a behavioural focus, we were extremely enthusiastic about that. And I think the report's been extremely well received, and it's been great to see people's enthusiasm for this approach and for this framework. It's also important to say that even at the point where we started this report, we felt that a lot of progress and a lot of great things had been done by the regulators in this space. So obviously the Financial Conduct Authority has their own behavioural science and data science team, and they do some really excellent research. And across all of the regulators, there was they've been embracing this behavioural approach. However, we felt that at the time, with the CMA energy market investigation and banking market investigation about to come out, it was a very timely moment to sort of take stock on what had been achieved already and also lay down a challenge for what more could be done in this space in the future. So this is the structure of the report and broadly the pattern that I'm going to follow in my presentation today. So firstly, we set out why markets aren't necessarily delivering the best outcomes for consumers. And then we went through some of the key behavioural biases which are at play in these markets, particularly in the energy market and the retail banking markets. And then finally, we set out our vision and framework for regulating with a behavioural focus. And this is what I'm going to focus the presentation on today, because I think it's particularly relevant to the audience here, and I'm very keen to hear your views in the panel discussion. But firstly, on the first point of why markets aren't delivering the best outcomes for consumers. So the traditional justification for regulatory intervention, and indeed the core role of the regulator, is to correct for market failures and the consumer detriment that arises from market failures. However, there is evidence that this traditional approach isn't delivering optimal outcomes for consumers. If you take the energy market, for example, it's a privatised market. There's a healthy number of suppliers, and consumers can switch freely between suppliers with very few barriers. And yet, almost 10 million households could save over £300 by switching energy provider. And the CMA estimates that that amounts to around £1.4 billion of value that's left on the table every year. And as you can see from these stats, we're seeing this situation happen across these markets in the UK. And so one explanation for why that traditional regulatory approach is not providing a complete solution in these markets is because it's underpinned by an assumption that the agents and consumers in these markets are acting in perfectly rational ways. And there's really two problems with that assumption. The first is that there is indeed compelling evidence that consumer behaviour systematically strays from what we would expect from a rational actor. It's not irrational behaviour in many senses. The shortcuts and biases that consumers display in these markets are extremely efficient and sensible. They allow them to make quick decisions in complex environments. However, they can also lead them to making errors and imposing costs upon themselves that they wouldn't do if they weren't displaying these biases in these markets. And the second issue with it is that it can also lead to unnecessary and complex red tape, which both provides a burden on business and also doesn't really deliver any real value for consumers. And I think a great example of that is product disclosure statements, which, as you all know, are extremely long, not particularly well read by consumers. They create a huge burden for business, but don't actually correct any of those information asymmetries that we see in these markets. And so in the report, we go through the key behavioural biases that we see in these consumer markets. On this slide, I've listed all of them that we go through, but broadly they're in order of importance, both in terms of the detriment that they cause to consumers, but also in terms of how impactful we think any particular behavioural solution could be. So for example, the first one, consumer inertia, that we have a tendency to stick with the default. One of the great behavioural interventions here is automatic enrolment into workplace pensions, where we see that the number of people signing up for or who are enrolled in workplace pensions has been dramatically increased by switching that system from an opt-in system to an opt-out system. Now, this is the framework that we set out in the report, and really the crux of this report and what I'd like to discuss today. Just to go through each pillar briefly. The first is to set the criteria for what a well-functioning market would look like from a consumer perspective. So to really say, what do consumers want out of these markets, and are they delivering them? Secondly, to collect and publish data to see whether that's being achieved. To design remedies to overcome any identified behavioural market failures. And finally, to test and iterate to see whether these are delivering the desirable outcomes. So, I'm missing a slide in there. So just to take the first one, what we're really trying to achieve here is to send a clear signal to the market about what a good supplier looks like, and actually what consumers care about when they're picking their supplier and when they're participating in these markets. So for example, some of these metrics might look like how many people in the market are not getting a bad deal. And I know that wording sounds a little tortured, but what I mean is how many people could save from switching, and can we decrease both the number of people who could save and also the amount that they could save within these markets. Some other ideas for really getting at that core of what it looks like from a consumer perspective, consumer comprehension of key pieces of information like bills, product disclosures, and other things, and we can test that very effectively in a laboratory setting and also in a field setting. And also consumer satisfaction, and satisfaction about the things that they really care about. So for example, if they complain about a particular issue, is that complaint resolved satisfactorily? And those are the types of metrics that we're talking about here. But of course, for those kind of metrics to work, you need good data. And one of the recommendations that we make in the report is that regulators should be pulling in every source of data that they can. So just as an illustration, this is a chart from the Citizens Advice Trends data. And what you can really see here is the volume of advice requests on different issues. And if you just have a look at the grey line, which is the third from the bottom here, these are the advice requests on payday loan debts. And if you'll see from about the fourth quarter of 13-14, they start to dip off and then trail off. And that's the point at which the FCA introduced new regulation on payday lending, which introduced a cap on fees and also a cap on the amount that people had to repay on payday loans. And this is just a really neat illustration of how you can see within this type of data, actually, is that regulation working? And also, you can spot trends where people are requesting more advice about issues, and as a regulator, you might be thinking, well, is this something we should be focusing on? Now, the third pillar of the framework is behaviourally informed remedies. And really, what we're arguing for here is that regulators design interventions that are well matched to the behavioural biases that they're trying to overcome in individual markets. And really, taking this behavioural lens both complements the regulator's toolkit, so you can have behaviourally informed sticks and carrots and incentives and behaviourally informed information provision, but it also provides really a wider and more nuanced toolkit, which also includes things like nudges and rules of thumb and other approaches that you can use to achieve better consumer outcomes in these markets. So I think I'm out of time, but broadly I'm happy to talk about some of these in the panel discussion, and also about Ofgem in particular, and I think Beth's going to talk later about some of the great work that Ofgem is doing in both embracing this approach and implementing the CMA's recommendations, and also that the great work that Ofgem and other regulators are doing on embedding a routine program of testing within their core function. So thank you very much.